Going on? Well, thanks for tuning in once again. Let's recap Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. You know, what a great fight. Um, Definitely lived up to the hype. You know, I was concerned about that. I didn't think that Benn would actually go the distance. You know, I was choosing Eubank to win. Um, but overall, you know, great fight, great heart from both fighters. Um, I thought the right man definitely won. You know, I had Eubank winning the fight. Um, I thought that Eubank was good going forward. You know, I wasn't expecting him to actually fight that way. I thought that Conor Benn would be more front-footed, but Eubank actually controlled the fight a bit more than Benn, and was more effective. You know, the thing is that Benn couldn't really shorten his punches. What I thought, you know, he done well with the wide shots, feinting and trying to land the right hand. You know, Eubank had that controlled. He was landing punches on Eubank, don't get me wrong, but Eubank found a way to come forward. You know, after throwing punches, he would come forward, duck down low. So it was surprising for me. You know, I was expecting Benn to be the one trying to get Eubank on the ropes, but it was actually Eubank ending the fight with Benn on the ropes, you know, on his last legs, you could say. Both guys were landing big punches. As I mentioned in the breakdown, you know, I thought that Benn needed to slow him down more. You know, he already had that weight clause. I thought that Benn needed to go for the body, target the body as much as he could, you know, just so that he can slow him down even more and take him out late. You know, I wasn't seeing Benn winning this fight on points at all. My prediction was a knockout from Eubank. You know, Benn proved me wrong. You know, he did show a lot of heart. I'll give him that. He wasn't running away. You know, he was standing toe-to-toe with him. But I just think that Benn couldn't fight on the back foot. You know, he couldn't shorten his punches, like I say. You know, when Eubank found out that he can keep holding Benn, that's where, you know, it was danger for him. You know, he couldn't really do what he wanted to do, you know, because Benn's a guy that likes to let his hands go. You know, he likes to let his hands go, and if you're tying him up all the time, you know, he can't do that. You know what I mean? So, great fight plan from Eubank. You know, I believe he did have to change up his strategy. He did figure out that this guy can't really fight on the back foot. He can't shorten his punches. He can't hurt me deep inside the pocket. You know, that's what I thought anyway. When he was hurting, Eubank was like at mid-range. You know, he couldn't really get Eubank on the back foot. You know, he couldn't really get him on the ropes, cut off the ring. It was basically, he would land punches, Eubank would land punches, then he will tie him up. And Eubank was winning the exchanges. You know, Eubank was winning the exchanges when they did tie up. You know, he was more stronger. He had the stronger frame. You know, he was able to, like I say, control the fight better. It was a brawl, you know, it was a brawl, but the thing is that even though it was a brawl, but it was in Conor's favour, because Conor couldn't really fight on the back foot, you know, Eubank just took full advantage of that. You know what I mean? He just took full advantage of that. He was able to push him around. You know, you saw Conor Benn on the ground at times. You know, he would push him over. He was clearly the stronger out of the two, you know, in terms of core strength. Conor Benn, you know, he did have his moments, but he just couldn't let his hands go enough. You know, he had to, like I said in the breakdown, get Eubank to the ropes and just let his hands go. You know, Eubank didn't allow that because Eubank's so good with the jab. You know, it was always going to be hard to land more than 3 punches, combinations and things like that on him, you know, because he was fighting behind the jab. So Benn needed to really slow him down so that he could do that. You know, he really needed to slow him down and then take him out second half of the fight. You know, let's just face it, Eubank is the more experienced fighter. even with the weight clause, you know, I wasn't expecting Benn to win this. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, I was surprised at the chin of Benn's, but that could be, you know, the weight clause, possibly. You know, who knows? He may not have had as much power as he would have if he never had that 170 weight clause in play. But I'll take my hat off to both of them. You know, both of them had a great fight. It was definitely worth watching from round 1 to 12. It was entertaining. You know, Senior pulls up. You know, Eubank Senior was there as well. You know, which was great to see. You know, so I mean, overall, Eubank was just the more superior. He figured out a way to avoid Benn's right hand, you know, by ducking low, pushing forward, tying him up. So Benn's best punch, you know, he couldn't land, basically, enough. He couldn't land it enough, and he definitely couldn't take out Eubank with one punch. You know, Eubank's the bigger puncher. So there is going to be a rematch. You know, I would love to see the rematch. I thought that this fight was a Eubank fight. I thought that Benn could have possibly, you know, done more in those last rounds. But then again, you know, like I said, he couldn't really fight on the back foot. He couldn't shorten his punches. You know, this is something that he needs to work on in the next one. But overall, Eubank, great performance, great fight, great hearts. And, you know, he was going for it at the end. You know, that round 12 was very entertaining. I thought that he had Benn. You know, Benn showed good heart in that last round. You know, I thought that was it. But yeah, like I mentioned in the breakdown, you know, Eubank wins this. I did mention the uppercut, you know, but because Benn was so much on the back foot in this fight, you know, Eubank couldn't really catch him coming forward. You know, Benn was throwing not enough combinations, you know, because he couldn't really. He was getting tied up, so he would throw one or two feints, and then he couldn't really get a rhythm where he could just come forward, you know, and be confident to push back Eubank. But he did land the uppercut. You know, he did rock him with the uppercut as I expected. You know, I was calling that to be the knockout punch, but because Eubank was on the front foot, he did what he needed to do. Rastafari, you know, that was a classic post-speech from Chris Eubank Senior. You know, I really enjoyed this fight. Leave your take on it. You know, was it as close as people thought? I thought that Eubank won the fight by at least 2 rounds, 2 to 3 rounds, you know, but that's me anyway. I thought that he controlled the fight well in the start. The commentary wasn't really giving him much credit for that, but you know, he definitely did come out stronger in the second half, and once he figured out that he can push him around and he's stronger than him, he's better than him in the exchange, at close range, he can you know, use his core strength. Eubank had that fight. So, I mean, great fight. Looking forward to the rematch. Do you want to see a rematch? Leave your take. Look forward to the comments. And I'll catch you next time. Peace.